Good morning, friends. We are in Tanglewood Tales, and we stopped about halfway through this first tale. It is about the Minotaur. So let's go ahead and pick up and see where Theseus is now. The goblet was set on a table beside the king's throne, and a fly, meaning just to sip a little from the brim, immediately tumbled into it dead. Observing this, Medea looked round at the nephews and smiled again. When Theseus was ushered into the royal apartment, the only object that he seemed to behold was the white-bearded old king. There he sat on his magnificent throne, a dazzling crown on his head and a scepter in his hand. His aspect was stately and majestic, although his years and infirmities weighed heavily upon him, as if each year were a lump of lead, and each infirmity a ponderous stone. And all were bundled up together and laid upon his weary shoulders. The tears both of joy and sorrow sprang into the young man's eyes, for he thought how sad it was to see his dear father so infirm, and how sweet it would be to support him with his own youthful strength, and to cheer him up with the alacrity of his loving spirit. When a son takes a father into his warm heart, it renews the old man's youth in a better way than by the heat of Medea's magic cauldron. And this was what Theseus resolved to do. He could scarcely wait to see whether King Aegeus would recognize him, so eager was he to throw himself into his arms. Advancing to the foot of the throne, he attempted to make a little speech, which he had been thinking about, as he came up the stairs. But he was almost choked by a great many tender feelings that gushed out of his heart and swelled into his throat, all struggling to find utterance together. And therefore, unless he could have laid his full, over-brimming heart into the king's hand, poor Theseus knew not what to do or say. The cunning Medea observed what was passing in the young man's mind. She was more wicked at that moment than ever she had been before, and it makes me tremble to tell you of it, she did her worst to turn all this unspeakable love with which Theseus was agitated to his own ruin and destruction. "Does your majesty see his confusion?" she whispered in the king's ear. "He is so conscious of guilt that he trembles and cannot speak. The wretch lives too long. Quick, offer him the wine." Now, King Aegeus had been gazing earnestly at the young stranger as he drew near the throne. There was something, he knew not what, either in his white brow or in the fine expression of his mouth or in his beautiful and tender eyes, that made him indistinctly feel as if he had seen this youth before, as if indeed he had trotted him on his knee when a baby, and had beheld him growing to be a stalwart man, while he himself grew old. But Medea guessed how the king felt, and would not suffer him to yield to these natural sensibilities, although they were the voice of his deepest heart, telling him as plainly as it could speak that there was our dear son and Aethra's son coming to claim him for a father. The enchantress again whispered in the king's ear and compelled him by her witchcraft to see everything under a false aspect. He made up his mind, therefore, to let Theseus drink off the poisoned wine. "Young man," said he, "you are welcome. I am proud to show hospitality to so heroic a youth. Do me the favor to drink the contents of this goblet. It is brimming over, as you see, with delicious wine, such as I bestow only on those who are worthy of it. None is more worthy to quaff it than yourself." So saying, King Aegeus took the golden goblet from the table and was about to offer it to Theseus, but partly through his infirmities, and partly because it seemed so sad a thing to take away this young man's life, however wicked he might be, and partly, no doubt, because his heart was wiser than his head, and quaked within him at the thought of what he was going to do. For all these reasons, the king's hand trembled so much that a great deal of the wine slopped over. In order to strengthen his purpose, and fearing lest the whole of the precious poison should be wasted, one of his nephews now whispered to him, "Has your majesty any doubt of this stranger's guilt? This is the very sword with which he meant to slay you. How sharp and bright and terrible it is! Quick, let him taste the wine, or perhaps he may do the deed even yet." At these words, Aegeus drove every thought and feeling out of his breast, except the one idea of how justly the young man deserved to be put to death. He sat erect on his throne and held out the goblet of wine with a steady hand and bent on Theseus a frown of kingly severity. For, after all, he had too noble a spirit to murder even a treacherous enemy with a deceitful smile upon his face. "Drink," said he, in the stern tone with which he was wont to condemn a criminal to be beheaded. "You have well deserved of me such wine as this." Theseus held out his hand to take the wine, but before he touched it, King Aegeus trembled again. His eyes had fallen on the golden hilt sword that hung at the young man's side. He drew back the goblet. "That sword!" he exclaimed. "How came you by it?" "It was my father's sword," replied Theseus with a tremulous voice. "These were his sandals. My dear mother, her name is Ethra, told me a story while I was yet a child, but it is only a month since I grew strong enough to lift the heavy stone and take the sword and sandals from beneath it and come to Athens to seek my father." "My son! My son!" cried King Aegeus, flinging away the fatal goblet and tottering down from the throne to fall into the arms of Theseus. "Yes, these are Ethra's eyes. It is my son." I have quite forgotten what became of the king's nephews, but when the wicked Medea saw this new turn of affairs, she hurried out of the room, and going to her private chamber, lost no time setting her enchantments to work. In a few moments she heard a great noise of hissing snakes outside the chamber window, and behold, there was her fiery chariot, and 4 huge winged serpents wriggling and twisting in the air, flourishing their tails higher than the top of the palace, and all ready to set off on an aerial journey. Medea stayed only long enough to take her sons with her and to steal the crown jewels, together with the king's best robes and whatever other valuable things she could lay hands on, and getting into the chariot, she whipped up the snakes and ascended high over the city. The king, hearing the hiss of the serpents, scrambled as fast as he could to the window, and bawled out to the abominable enchantress never to come back. The whole people of Athens, too, who had run out of doors to see this wonderful spectacle, set up a shout of joy at the prospect of getting rid of her. Medea, almost bursting with rage, uttered precisely such a hiss as one of her own snakes, only 10 times more venomous and spiteful. And glaring fiercely out of the blaze of the chariot, she took her hands over the multitude below, as if she were scattering 1,000,000 of curses among them. In doing so, however, she unintentionally let fall about 500 diamonds of the first water, together with 1,000 great pearls and 2,000 emeralds, rubies, sapphires, opals, and topazes, to which she had helped herself out of the king's strong box. All these came pelting down like a shower of many-colored hailstones upon the heads of grown people and children, who forthwith gathered them up and carried them back to the palace. But King Aegeus told them that they were welcome to the whole, and to twice as many more, if he had them for the sake of his delight at finding his son and losing the wicked Medea. And indeed, if you had seen how hateful was her last look, as the flaming chariot flew upward, you would not have wondered that both king and people should think her departure a good riddance. And now Prince Theseus was taken into great favor by his royal father. The old king was never weary of having him sit beside him on the throne, which was quite wide enough for 2, and of hearing him tell about his dear mother and his childhood, and his many boyish efforts to lift the ponderous stone. Theseus, however, was much too brave and active a young man to be willing to spend all his time in relating things which had already happened. His ambition was to perform other and more heroic deeds which should be better worth telling in prose and verse. Nor had he been long in Athens before he caught and chained a terrible mad bull, and made a public show of him, greatly to the wonder and admiration of good Aegeus and his subjects. But pretty soon he undertook an affair that made all his foregone adventures seem like mere boys' play. The occasion of it was as follows. One morning, when Prince Theseus awoke, he fancied that he must have had a very sorrowful dream, and that it was still running in his mind, even now that his eyes were opened, for it appeared as if the air was full of a melancholy wail. And when he listened more attentively, he could hear sobs and groans and screams of woe mingled with deep, quiet sighs which came from the king's palace, and from the streets, and from the temples, and from every habitation of the city. And all these mournful noises, issuing out of thousands of separate hearts, united themselves in one great sound of affliction, which had startled Theseus from slumber. He put on his clothes as quickly as he could, not forgetting his sandals and gold-hilted sword, and hastening to the king inquired what it all meant. "Alas, my son," quoth King Aegeus, heaving a long sigh, "here is a very lamentable matter at hand. This is the woefulest anniversary in the whole year. It is the day when we annually draw lots to see which of the youths and maids of Athens shall go to be devoured by the horrible Minotaur." "The Minotaur!" exclaimed Prince Theseus, and like a brave young prince as he was, he put his hand to the hilt of his sword. "What kind of monster may that be? Is it not possible at the risk of one's life to slay him?" But King Aegeus shook his venerable head, and to convince Theseus that it was quite a hopeless case, he gave him an explanation of the whole affair. It seems that in the island of Crete there lived a certain dreadful monster called a Minotaur, which was shaped partly like a man and partly like a bull, and was altogether such a hideous sort of creature that it is really disagreeable to think of him. If he were suffered to exist at all, it should have been on some desert island, or in the duskiness of some deep cavern, where nobody would ever be tormented by his abominable aspect. But King Minos, who reigned over Crete, laid out a vast deal of money in building the habitation for the Minotaur, and took great care of his health and comfort, merely for mischief's sake. A few years before this time, there had been a war between the city of Athens and the island of Crete, in which the Athenians were beaten and compelled to beg for peace. No peace could they obtain, however, except on condition that they should send 7 young men and 7 maidens every year to be devoured by the pet monster of the cruel King Minos. For 3 years past, this grievous calamity had been borne, and the sobs and groans and shrieks with which the city was now filled were caused by the people's woe, because the fatal day had come again, when the 14 victims were to be chosen by lot, and the old people feared lest their sons or daughters might be taken, and the youths and damsels dreaded lest they themselves might be destined to glut the ravenous maw of that detestable man-brute. But when Theseus heard the story, he straightened himself up, so that he seemed taller than ever before, and as for his face, it was indignant, despiteful, bold, tender, and compassionate, all in one look. "Let the men of Athens draw this year's lots for only 6 young men instead of 7, and I will myself be the 7th, and let the Minotaur devour me, if he can." "Oh, my dear son," cried King Aegeus, "why should you expose yourself to this horrible fate? You are a royal prince, and have a right to hold yourself above the destinies of common men. It is because I am Prince, your son, and the rightful heir of your kingdom, that I freely take upon me the calamity of your subjects," answered Theseus. "And you, my father, being king over these people, and answerable to heaven for their welfare, are bound to sacrifice what is dearest to you, rather than the son or daughter of the poorest citizen should come to any harm." The old king shed tears, and besought Theseus not to leave him desolate in his old age, more especially as he had but just begun to know the happiness of possessing a good and valiant son. Theseus, however, felt that he was in the right, and therefore would not give up his resolution. But he assured his father that he did not intend to be eaten up, unresistingly like a sheep, and that, if the Minotaur devoured him, it should not be without a battle for his dinner. And finally, since he could not help it, King Aegeus consented to let him go. So a vessel was got ready and rigged with black sails, and Theseus, with 6 other young men and 7 tender and beautiful damsels, came down to the harbor to embark. A sorrowful multitude accompanied them to the shore. There was the poor old king, too, leaning on his son's arm and looking as if his single heart held all the grief of Athens. Just as Prince Theseus was going on board, his father bethought himself of one last word to say. "My beloved son," he said, grasping the prince's hand, "you observe that the sails of this vessel are black, as indeed they ought to be, since it goes upon a voyage of sorrow and despair. Now being weighed down with infirmities, I know not whether I can survive till the vessel shall return. But as long as I do live, I shall creep daily to the top of yonder cliff to watch if there be a sail upon the sea. And, dearest Theseus, if by some happy chance you should escape the jaws of the Minotaur, then tear down those dismal sails and hoist others that shall be bright as the sunshine. Beholding them on the horizon, myself and all the people will know that you are coming back victorious, and will welcome you with such a festal uproar as Athens never heard before." Theseus promised that he would do so. Then going on board, the mariners trimmed the vessel's black sails to the wind, which blew faintly off the shore, being pretty much made up of the sighs that everybody kept pouring forth on this melancholy occasion. But by and by, when they had got fairly out to sea, there came a stiff breeze from the northwest, and drove them along as merrily over the white-capped waves as if they had been going on the most delightful errand imaginable. And though it was sad business enough, I rather question whether 14 young people, without any old persons to keep them in order, could continue to spend the whole time of the voyage in being miserable. There had been some few dances upon the undulating deck, I suspect, and some hearty bursts of laughter, and other such unreasonable merriment among the victims before the high blue mountains of Crete began to show themselves among the far-off clouds. That sight, to be sure, made them all very grave again. Theseus stood among the sailors, gazing eagerly toward the land, although as yet it seemed hardly more substantial than the clouds amidst which the mountains were looming up. Once or twice he fancied that he saw a glare of some bright object, a long way off, flinging a gleam across the waves. "Did you see that flash of light?" he inquired of the master of the vessel. "No, Prince, but I have seen it before," answered the master. "It came from Talus, I suppose." As the breeze came fresher just then, the master was busy with trimming his sails, and had no more time to answer questions. But while the vessel flew faster and faster toward Crete, Theseus was astonished to behold a human figure, gigantic in size, which appeared to be striding with a measured movement along the margin of the island. It stepped from cliff to cliff, and sometimes from one headland to another, while the sea foamed and thundered on the shore beneath, and dashed its jets of spray over the giant's feet. What was still more remarkable, whenever the sun shone on this huge figure, it flickered and glimmered. Its vast countenance, too, had a metallic luster, and threw great flashes of splendor through the air. The folds of its garments, moreover, instead of waving in the wind, fell heavily over its limbs, as if woven on some kind of metal. The nigher the vessel came, the more Theseus wondered what this immense giant could be, and whether it actually had life or no. For though it walked and made other lifelike motions, there yet was a kind of jerk in its gait, which together with its brazen aspect caused the young prince to suspect that it was no true giant, but only a wonderful piece of machinery. The figure looked all the more terrible because it carried an enormous brass club on its shoulder. "What is this wonder?" Theseus asked of the master of the vessel, who was now at leisure to answer him. "It is Talus, the man of brass," said the master. "And is he a live giant or a brazen image?" asked Theseus. "That, truly," replied the master, "is the point which has always perplexed me. Some say, indeed, that this Talus was hammered out for King Minos by Vulcan himself, the skillfulest of all workers in metal. But whoever saw a brazen image that had sense enough to walk round an island 3 times a day, as this giant walks round the island of Crete, challenging every vessel that comes nigh the shore? And on the other hand, what living thing, unless his sinews were made of brass, would not be weary of marching 1,800 miles in the 24 hours as Talus does, without ever sitting down to rest? He is a puzzler, take him how you will." Still the vessel went bounding onward, and now Theseus could hear the brazen clangor of giant footsteps as he trod heavily upon the sea-beaten rocks, some of which were seen to crack and crumble in the foaming waves beneath his weight. As they approached the entrance of the port, the giant straddled clear across it, with a foot firmly planted on each headland, and uplifting his club to such a height that its butt end was hidden in the cloud. He stood in that formidable posture, with the sun gleaming all over his metallic surface. There seemed nothing else to be expected but that. The next moment, he would fetch his great club down, slam bang, and smash the vessel into 1,000 pieces, without heeding how many innocent people he might destroy. For there is seldom any mercy in a giant, you know, and quite as little in a piece of brass clockwork. Just then, when Theseus and his companions thought the blow was coming, the brazen lips unclosed themselves, and the figure spoke. "Whence come you, strangers?" And when the ringing voice ceased, there was just such a reverberation as you may have heard within a great church bell, for a moment or two after the stroke of the hammer. "From Athens," shouted the master in reply. "On what errand?" thundered the man of brass. And he whirled his club aloft more threateningly than ever, as if he were about to smite them with a thunderstroke right amidship, because Athens, so little while ago, had been at war with Crete. "We bring the 7 youths and the 7 maidens," answered the master, "to be devoured by the Minotaur." "Pass," cried the brazen giant. That one loud word rolled all about the sky, while again there was a booming reverberation within the figure's breast. The vessel glided between the headlands of the port, and the giant resumed his march. In a few moments this wondrous sentinel was far away, flashing in the distant sunshine and revolving with immense strides round the island of Crete, as it was his never-ceasing task to do. No sooner had they entered the harbor than a party of the guards of King Minos came down to the waterside and took charge of the 14 young men and damsels. Surrounded by these armed warriors, Prince Theseus and his companions were led to the king's palace and ushered into his presence. Now Minos was a stern and pitiless king. If the figure that guarded Crete was made of brass, then the monarch who ruled over it might be thought to have a still harder metal in his breast, and might have been called a man of iron. He bent his shaggy brows upon the poor Athenian victims. Any other mortal, beholding their fresh and tender beauty and their innocent looks, would have felt himself sitting on thorns, until he had made every soul of them happy by bidding them go free as the summer wind. But this imitagible Minos cared only to examine whether they were plump enough to satisfy the Minotaur's appetite. For my part, I wish he himself had been the only victim, and the monster would have found him a pretty tough one. One after another, King Minos called these pale, frightened youths and sobbing maidens to his footstool, gave them each a poke in the ribs with his scepter to try whether they were in good flesh or no, and dismissed them with a nod to his guards. But when his eyes rested on Theseus, the king looked at him more attentively, because his face was calm and brave. "Young man," said he, with a stern voice, "are you not appalled at the certainty of being devoured by this terrible Minotaur?" "I have offered my life in a good cause," answered Theseus, and therefore I give it freely and gladly. But thou, King Minos, art thou not thyself appalled, who year after year hast perpetuated this dreadful wrong by giving 7 innocent youths and as many maidens to be devoured by a monster? Dost thou not tremble, wicked king, to turn thine eyes inward on thine own heart, sitting there on thy golden throne, and in thy robes of majesty? I tell thee to thy face, King Minos, thou art a more hideous monster than the Minotaur himself. Aha, do you think me so? Cried the king, laughing in his cruel way. Tomorrow, at breakfast time, you shall have the opportunity of judging which is the greater monster, the Minotaur or the king. Take them away, guards, and let this free-spoken youth be the Minotaur's first morsel.